Welcome to Girl on the Gov, the podcast,
where our goal is to make politics more accessible and less intimidating.
The show features an interview with an expert in the political field, walking us through the many cues we have about politics, civics, government, and more.
By providing civic education in the places we are, on our phones, and in the language we speak. And yes, we know we say like a lot.
It's kind of the point, because politics needed a rebrand. Welcome back to Girl on the Gov, the podcast. Happy Wednesday. We haven't really broken down a news story in a minute, but I feel like this stupid ass Kevin McCarthy moment is one that we should maybe, chit chat about.
Yeah, it literally, I saw it break when I was writing viral today, and I was like, ugh, for the love of God. McCarthy, really? But also not surprised. This has been something that the Republicans have been teasing for months, beyond that probably. And not surprised. It was more of a matter of when. But what was so interesting to me, besides that it's okay, you guys are gonna really go down this impeachment route, is it's they really think that they've put the wool over people's eyes. Meanwhile, it's we know you guys are just trying to normalize impeachment so that it can't be used as a total weapon by candidates on the Dem side or even independent side in these next elections. Because you can't be Trump was impeached, how can you reelect a twice impeached president? And then if they impeach Biden, they're Biden was
seem
impeached.
Like a worthless
yeah
thing, which it kind of is. Now it kind of is. But yeah. I mean, there's a lot to this and a lot to kind of dissect. I feel first of all, Kevin McCarthy's, this move by him is very much, pressure from his right fringe colleagues that, won't work with him, especially during this kind of crucial time with budget tings and government shutdowns. He's just bending over for this right fringe, for a lack of a better term. Yeah, of course. But no, it is so interesting just thinking about the public's perception of impeachment and how I had one of my friends sent this story being oh my God, Biden's getting impeached, because you see that and it's so dramatic, and if you don't know the politics of it, you're right. Oh shit, what did he do? And now he looks potentially like this corrupt guy, and it just now it sucks because it's it is kind of a worthless thing given that Trump was impeached twice and nothing really happened from it. And it becomes this battle of public perception of does this even matter? But then also you learn about impeachment in civics growing up. I remember being taught that part of our government and how it works. And it just seems like such a dramatic step. So it's interesting to see how people are going to take this, and especially obviously going into an election year, but it's just so fucking stupid. Oh, you froze. Oh my God, that was so funny. You were giving me just the funniest face. I was oh God, are you gonna respond?
I love a good freeze frame. God damn it. Well, regardless, what I was gonna say was that there was this interview with Nancy Mace, who's a congresswoman from South Carolina. She was talking about well, we're gonna do the investigation to find evidence. It's you're doing an investigation to find evidence for what? You don't have the plot, you don't have the thesis. And I just feel it's the Republicans are all that, we're weaponizing government, we're weaponizing the DOJ, blah, 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 we're weaponizing the FBI, whatever. It's no, this is the definition of doing that. You guys managed to do exactly what you say others are doing. It's such a weird mindfuck, and I just find the whole thing exhausting. And that leads me to the proper reaction, which is John Fetterman's. Did you see it?
I did. And it was exactly how I feel about the situation. Am I worried about Biden getting impeached? No, not at all. Yeah, but it just goes back to this public perception thing of what voters are going to think in an already just scary election that's coming up of low approval ratings, people not wanting it to be Biden, just add it to the list kind of thing.
What this is going to add to my pet peeves list. I think this is only something that has been added to the list since us working in politics. I don't know if I would have felt the same pre, is the onslaught of discussion about polling numbers. Like, I am so tired of hearing that, oh, well, the approval rating is 42%, 33%, like whatever it is. It's like, I don't want to hear about like random polling numbers. I want to hear about like what they actually did or didn't do. Like,
yeah,
I don't care about your random survey in Wyoming. I mean, God bless Wyoming, but you know what I mean?
It shouldn't be news in September, a year before the election. It just shouldn't be news at this point. It is obviously helpful, like, you know, now working on like kind of the messaging side. Obviously, you need to do that research to figure out where people are at and how to message correctly to them and make sure that they're ready to go next year. But why is it news? Like, it's not news right now.
You
like,
just nailed it.
Regular people don't need to know that. You know, it's just like,
it's
stupid.
just, I can't.
Biden is getting impeached. And not only that, but it is in the midst of a looming government shutdown where Republicans are wanting to cut the budget for government services that benefit working families and want to give tax cuts to corporations and rich people. It's like, in what world do people see this party and think they're working for me? Because I haven't seen them do a goddamn thing for a normal American in years.
No, but actually, like, I couldn't tell you a time or a moment or a thing, a result. And I think what like people need to remember, and we've definitely talked about this at some point, is like the classic Republican strategy is like the long haul of like destroying a program, where first they reduce the funding and then they like have like a public like media campaign against it. And then the program can't properly function and help the people it needs to actually help. And so then they have like some sort of quote unquote evidence for saying that this thing doesn't work. But meanwhile, they're not funding it because they're saying tax or cut all the funding for it, give all these tax credits to the fucking rich.
Yeah.
It is.
And just like say what you want about Democrats. Obviously, it's flawed. That's what we really built this podcast on, is knowing that we will always say that.
Yeah.
But think about it in terms of what's been done over the past few years, in terms of Democratic accomplishments and who they have been done for, from infrastructure to clean air, clean energy jobs, stopping oil drilling and listening to young people everywhere and finally fucking taking action on that. Student loan relief. Just like the list goes on. It's always like, here's what the Republicans done this week. Meanwhile, Democrats, the bullet list of items of actual like legit solution and like legislation.
Some of it really is so good. Like, to the like point, I was so like obviously pretty political fam, and my dad knows about the infrastructure bill, etc. It's like, okay, there's going to be some benefits. Maybe it'll be okay. And I was like, no, like you really need to look into like what you can do for your house. Like, I'm telling you, finally, with enough forwarding of the like rewiring emails, Dad actually looked into it. I got a call. Oh my God, $14,000 in rebates in 2024 for like winterized. Like, I was like, first of all, another told you so moment. But seriously, it's like
need that storytelling. Yeah, it's also
because
just so
really
hard though for people.
Level.
Yeah. And also it's like a whole nother conversation. It's just how like also shitty our government as a whole is as of communicating government resources and benefits and services to people to actually then use them, which is another battle, which is just because at the end of the day, like a lot of these solutions help people get reelected. And so it's like almost about messaging for like turning out voters versus like, okay, we also need to like message and tell people that these things exist and that they can access them and like actually these things will benefit their lives.
1,000%. And it is really hard to know like what is out there. I feel like it's because you don't even a lot of times like know what to even Google. Maybe it's like a small business grant thing. Okay, so you're like looking at small business grant, but what if it's like under a specific category and like you don't know the category, so it's like you can't find some of this shit. So I just, again, like I think the resource,
it's just like
distribution needs to be better. Distribution,
and then
messaging.
Instead it's just like politicized, and they're like, look at what we did, and then it's like, okay, cool. Well, like I don't feel that in my life, so it's like maybe we swap political ads for like an ad that says, hey, here's this is from Joe Biden. sponsored by Joe Biden. Hey, this is the piece of legislation I just passed. Here's the website and the 1, 2, 3 step for you to access so-and-so benefit. And then people are like, oh, like he's just telling me how he's helping me. And then that's going to translate ultimately to like election day, you know?
Madison Blue, this is the most genius idea you've ever had. And you've had some good ones. But this one, gorgeous, beautiful, iconic, perfect.
Thank you.
If I hadn't pissed off that person at the DNC, we might have...
Well, I now work in like I do help make political ads. So now I'm actually going to maybe take that and run with it. So if you guys see that out in the wild, let me know. It might be from my noggin. Maybe. Anyways, political tangent aside, we haven't really like talked about politics in a minute because Top Story's has been on long vacation. She's been on summer vacation, just like thriving. So jealous of her.
She lives the best life. Like she literally is in the south of France.
I know.
Like what the hell?
I don't think
literally just
is she ever coming
bottle
back?
surface ad syndrome. I don't know.
We'll see. But nonetheless, we also have an interview, obviously, this week as well, and a guest to introduce. So I'm going to pass that over to Samantha per usual to introduce.
Yeah, let me just get the hair out of my mouth because I literally just gave myself like a cat-like hairball. Thank you, slut strands.
What?
You don't? These are called slut strands. Yeah.
Slut?
Yes.
Slut? Just kidding. One more time. Slut? I've never heard that.
Okay, so guys, you missed the precursor to us recording this, and Maddie has been living under a rock.
I guess I have.
Like, first of all, like slut strands, but fine. Okay, that's maybe it doesn't hit on the West Coast. I doubt it, but again, Maddie didn't know that Jimmy Fallon was canceled again. Had heard about the Kutcher situation. What was the other thing that you didn't hear? Oh, Drew Barrymore getting canceled because she's a scab and didn't know. I was going through like a list of like all the things that happened like the last 48 to 72 hours pop culture wise, and she was just like looking at me like I had 10 heads and more than usual. Like not the usual like, Sam, what are you talking about? Like this was like a serious 10 head. Like also not to like pat myself in the back, but from doing viral and like being like, what is the term, like chronically online, from like pulling like different trends and things, I feel like our algorithm really goes in a gazillion directions, and then I zone. Which, side note, currently our entire favorites page is all women's tennis, and US Open social media person was like iconic, and you need to just, there's this one with Obama that's maybe, you know what, I'm gonna put it in this week's Hot Mic'd, and then you'll see it there. Which, by the way, guys, we have a third newsletter called Hot Mic'd. Go sign up for it. It's like all of our faves behind the scenes shit, like tea, POVs on political things and whatnot, Rex and all that. It's super fun. It's light. It's easy, breezy. Read it in less than 3 minutes tops. And it comes out on Thursdays. So go sign up for that. But anyways, we are getting distracted because we have a guest.
Yeah, we have a guest.
Anyways, this week we are talking to Emily Stochl, who's the director of education at Remake. And specifically, we're talking about the Fabric Act and what this would do for the garment industry and specifically garment workers, from wages to, of course, conditions and more, like what this would set the industry on a path to do. This act's being reintroduced this week, so the timing is chef's kiss perfect. We get into the whole kit and caboodle, if you will. So, of course, the act itself, but also just the current status of the garment industry and like what that looks like in 2023. So, without further ado, here's Emily. Emily, welcome to Girl Make Up the podcast. We are so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also so fun to have a fellow podcaster, which we'll get into a little bit. But you are the director of education at Remake. And for those that might not be familiar with Remake, what's the story? What do you guys do? Give us the rundown.
Yeah, so Remake is a fashion advocacy organization. So we are fighting for fair pay in the fashion industry as well as on climate justice issues. And I head up our Remake Ambassador program. So we're a global organization. We've got volunteer change makers all over the world. And I have the privilege of leading this coalition of change makers, like helping to equip them to understand campaigns and figure out how they can make change in the fashion industry so that we can make change in the fashion industry and make it a force for good.
I love that. And I have so many questions. I can't wait to dive in.
Well, you also have a podcast, like we mentioned, and you're the host of the Pre-Loved podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about the show?
Totally. Yeah. So I have been a vintage lover and a big thrifter for a long time. Like probably 15 or so years now, well before it was cool. And I think my love of secondhand is kind of what led me into my work at Remake, but it really goes back like a long ways. I started getting interested in labor rights because my grandma, who was a really big part of my upbringing, she was like a third parent to me. She was a union organizer at a plastics factory, and she was a single mom, raised 6 kids. And throughout my childhood, I would always hear these stories about like how her union job and the protections that that job offered her were so essential in her to be able to bring up all her kids, including my dad. And then, I grew up hearing these stories and things. And like I said, like I was a thrifter and stuff, but I didn't like connect the dots to issues within the fashion industry when I was a teenager. But then in 2013, the Rana Plaza factory in Dhaka, Bangladesh collapsed. And this is a very like pivotal moment within the labor history of the fashion industry, because this was one of the most deadly industrial factory disasters of all time. And at that time, I think I was like just getting out of college right around that time. And I was hearing all these stories about what was going on in the fashion industry. And the reality is that a lot of people who sew clothing in the fashion industry are young women, many of them young mothers, people like around my age, even at that time. And when I came to truly understand what those conditions were like, I couldn't help connecting the dots to the stories that I grew up with my grandma telling me, and realizing that the worker protections for workers around the globe have either significantly eroded or were just abysmal to begin with. And once I made those connections, I couldn't really turn back. The rest of this kind of history, it was like, to me, prioritizing secondhand like made sense, and it was like a values connected thing. And it's really through that I found my way to Remake.
Totally makes sense. It's funny, those moments in life where you're like, whoa, okay, we have entered the threshold, we've entered the door, and literally the rest is history. Like that's the path you're gonna, take, and the passion you find from it. And I think what was interesting in doing some of the research when you guys reached out about the Fabric Act, which of course we'll get into in a second, I really felt like, whoa, am I going back in time and like reading about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory situation? Like it really sort of showed to me like how much we haven't changed as a society in this sector. And of course, like I'm looking at through a domestic lens. Your example, what you just said was international, but there is a connection between that and also the connection between these being jobs that are mainly held by women and so on. And just so interesting and so many different dynamics to go down. But one, of course, we wanted to go down is the Fabric Act, what this would do, what it is. Can you give us the story there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting that you brought up the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, because I feel like in school, that's something we learn about when we're learning about history. And throughout history, a lot of the labor protections, of course, they could all be better, but a lot of the labor protections that here in the US we do have were won off of the backs of like really dedicated fighting garment workers in many cases. And so some of the policies that we do have today that protect workers come from, incidents and strikes that followed, things like that. But yes, not to go on too much of a tangent, the Fabric Act. So to tell the story of the proposed Federal Fabric Act, I kind of have to go back a little bit, because this is built off of a law that passed in the state of California in the fall of 2021 called the Garment Worker Protection Act. So the Garment Worker Protection Act in California was a worker-led piece of legislation. Basically, garment workers in Los Angeles, which is the largest garment apparel producing hub in the US today, set out to improve working conditions there. And they had 3 main goals with passing the Garment Worker Protection Act. First was the elimination of the system of piece rate pay in the fashion industry. So up until the passing of the Garment Worker Protection Act, sweatshops were still pervasive, even here in the United States, where we have a legal minimum wage. because of the system of piece rate pay. And piece rate pay is basically where the workers are paid by what is sewn. So like by the t-shirt sewn, by the pair of jeans finished, rather than being paid by the hour. And the result of the workers being paid that way is that workers in California were being paid on average between $2 and $5 an hour in a state where the minimum wage is $15 an hour. So that's the first and foremost thing that the Garment Worker Protection Act set out to do, is close that loophole and eliminate the system of piece rate pay. And as a result of passing this law, it effectively tripled the wages of garment workers in the state of California. And then another thing that it set out to do was to pass provisions that would hold fashion brands jointly accountable for wage theft that occurs in their factory. So a really common issue within the fashion industry is that there's a lot of subcontracting that happens in fashion. And so the fashion brands, like if you think of like the Forever 21 or something, they're the ones that have all the money in the system, and they set out the timelines for how fast the clothes need to be produced, and they set the price for what the product is. So in other words, like, they set all the conditions that add up to wage theft occurring in those factories. But then whenever there is a scandal of sorts, wage theft or, a workplace incident, the fashion brands themselves will claim no responsibility because they will say, oh, that's the fault of the factory and we subcontract to the factory. That's not us. We don't have anything to do with it. So another thing that the Garment Worker Protection Act did was tighten up that liability so that brands will at least have to take some responsibility for wage theft occurring in the factories where they produce their garments, and they won't be able to pass all of that responsibility along to the factories alone. And the last thing that it aims to do is put in place mechanisms for reporting wage theft so that the law can be safely enforced. So it's not good enough to just have a law. It has to be enforceable. So these are mechanisms where workers can, report if wage theft is occurring in their factory, and there are pathways for them to get remuneration of stolen wages. So passing this bill in California, like I said, the law passed in the fall of 2021. It went into effect at the start of 2022. That set a precedent at a statewide level, which then inspired a proposed federal version of this bill, which is what the Fabric Act is. So the Fabric Act would include all of those tenets that we talked about, but also, in addition to that, some major investments to kind of ramp up made in the USA apparel production and create good domestic apparel production jobs here at home in the US.
Okay. Well, I think it makes so much sense to have a federal variation of this, given that we have a federal minimum wage, that just baseline. Besides the fact that this whole idea of piece by piece, you said the phrase, and I'm going to totally mess this up.
Yeah, piece rate pay.
Piece rate pay. Yeah.
It's wild that it even exists, right?
Totally. Although I could make the argument, not to go down a total tangent, that it's kind of like affiliate marketing for creators.
It's so true. And we really believe that this law sets in place important precedents for industry industries, because fashion is not the only industry that operates off of this kind of thing. Like, think about gig workers of any kind, or affiliate marketing, like commission-based pay. Or, in agriculture, it's quite common for people to be picked by the weight of a load or something like that. And it's not to say that you can't have production-based incentives, but those should come above and beyond the minimum hourly wage that we've decided as a country or a state is the law.
Right. Yeah. That makes the most of sense, but like many things, obviously not being implemented. But curious to the Fabric Act, what is the current kind of status of this bill? Have you been working with reps? Who are the players? But also kind of where is it in its journey of potentially becoming passed?
Yeah. So it's really interesting because the fight for the bill to pass in the state of California was a long one. And so I know to expect an even longer journey to pass a federal law. We know that this could take a while, but where the Fabric Act is today, this is August, and the bill is being sponsored by Senator Kristen Gillibrand in New York. And it's going to be reintroduced into Congress this September during Fashion Month, which is really a prime opportunity for senators to come on board and endorse it. And so hopefully there will be a lot of news in your feeds about the Fabric Act soon, and lots of senators coming on board and championing this bill.
Totally. I'm curious, like to the point of it potentially taking a while. Is there a fashion lobby? I mean, I feel like there's a lobbyist for every industry down to like the screws in our tires. Like there is something for everyone kind of situation. Does that exist? Are you guys seeing that sort of come together? Did that happen with the California bill? Like what was the obstruction, if you will?
Yeah, definitely. We did come up against struggles with the California bill. Of course, some of the very large brands with a lot of money maybe did not want to see the Garment Worker Protection Act passed in California. But the reality is that there were a lot of champions for the bill. There were smaller, sustainable brands, ethical brands producing in California. You know, the brands who are doing like the right thing, they were being put at a disadvantage because their competitors were getting away with paying like $2 to $5 an hour, right? And so there were a lot of responsibly producing brands that wanted the Garment Worker Protection Act to level the playing field. And we're really proud that so far, you know, it continues to grow every day, which is just wonderful. But the Federal Fabric Act has 275 endorsers of brands and manufacturers who are now championing this bill to be passed at a federal level. So yes, to answer your question, we do go up against big business and money being thrown at stopping policies like this. But on the flip side, we do have the endorsement of producers who think that this would be really beneficial for the industry as well.
Mm-hmm. Who are some of the like brands and stuff that I guess are champions and not? Curious.
Yeah.
I love the tea.
Just kind of off the top of my head, some brands that have voiced their support for the Federal Fabric Act: Reformation, Mara Hoffman, Hope for Flowers, ThreadUp. Some of these brands have been championing it at a federal level. Oh, you know, brands that are opposed, you know, it's the ones that if you look them up, you know, producing in wage theft or producing in California and there's like the horrible wage theft cases against them. Forever 21 comes to mind. Ross comes to mind. I believe like Harley Davidson and Disney were tied up in this at one point. You know, it's the brands that kind of have the repeat wage theft cases against them that are opposing.
Harley Davidson. Interesting. What a plot twist.
It's sometimes it's more than you think. Like, I think we tend to think of the typical like fast fashion brands, like H&M, Forever 21, Shein, of course, comes to mind. But more fashion brands than you would think are implicated in this kind of thing.
Yeah. I also, just to keep going on this tangent, I'm just curious too, especially when it comes to kind of even, the climate angle of this conversation as well. Some of these brands, I'm kind of curious, like this price point of some of the like the H&Ms of the world, the Zara's, the Sheins, like they obviously sell their clothes at a lower price point, but there are a lot of brands that have higher price points that like often manufacture from the same places that those kind of cheaper companies do, right? So like, I don't know, I'm curious if you know more about that, or if there's kind of a way to identify which brands are kind of bad actors in this space. Lululemon, for example, like you can now get their same exact quality product from much cheaper companies now that are just like selling it from the same manufacturer. I don't know how that fully works, but I don't know if you can speak on that a little bit too. I'm super curious.
Yeah, no, you're so right. I mean, definitely price point is not really an indicator of ethical production, unfortunately. And those like mid-tier brands like a Lululemon, like Free People, Anthropology, like they're as guilty of this, as many of the other brands that we think of when it comes to fast fashion. So what I always tell people to look for in a brand is, transparent statements about paying their workers a decent wage. Because if they're doing it, they're shouting about it. And if they're not saying anything at all, it's a great indicator that there's something to hide there. Remake produces, you can find it on our site. Every year we do a fashion accountability report, and we look at about the top 60 most profitable brands. Within fashion, there's so many parent companies and like you mentioned. And so there's a lot of consolidation, few brands making up a lot of profit in the industry. And we look at those brands and kind of analyze their wage issues, their climate issues, overproduction, all sorts of metrics. And I mean, the reality is that across the board, whether you're looking at a big box retailer or kind of a mid-tier brand or even luxury, they're often guilty of the same issues.
Mm-hmm. That makes so much sense and just make me feel very validated in my this is more broad ranging approach to purchasing things, aka an argument that I constantly have had with my mom over the years, where she's like, oh, well, it's Ralph Lauren, it's gotta be cute. I'm like, just because it has a label on it that you've liked in the past doesn't make it cute. You have to really dig into something and see what's behind the curtain. So anyways, I'll be shouting out to my mom later on the phone, what you just said, because thank you. I am curious though about the garment industry in the US in general. What does it look like? What is the status of the industry? Is it a profitable industry? Is this one that was and then kind of went wayside? I feel my context of the garment industry in the US goes two things. One, Triangle Shirtwaist Factory back in the day, and two, American Apparel and their scandals.
I was going to say American Apparel.
Yeah. Right?
Yep.
TBT to also middle school, and we all had all
God,
of
I loved that place.
I know. Right. We all did. It was
my go-to Halloween, also Halloween costume making.
They always had it. Yeah, they always had it.
They also always had the fun stuff.
Yeah, it's so true. So, I think we tend to think when we think of apparel production in the US, we do tend to go back about 100 years because that's what we're taught in school. But it's true that the garment industry in the US is much smaller than it was at its heyday. At peak, which was about 1970s, early 1970s, the industry employed 1.4 million garment workers here in the US. And then today, it employs about 100,000 people. So you can understand that the, domestic apparel production has really shrunk. And I think we're all kind of familiar with why this has happened. We've seen a lot. It's not that the industry has shrunk by any means. The industry is larger than ever. But it's that production has been offshored and outsourced and gone overseas. But the reality is that, of course, like I said, the fashion industry is still quite large, still quite profitable. And we believe that the U.S. should be aiming to become a leader in responsibly produced apparel. And that's why the Fabric Act has these incentives for bringing production to the U.S. and creating good made in America jobs here in the U.S. Because there are other, you think of maybe France or the Netherlands or, some countries in Europe who are also passing really great legislation in order to be more sustainable and to protect workers more. And so we think that the US should be also trying to recruit those ethical brands and bring them here and have their factories producing here in the US.
Yeah, that's super interesting. What are some things that have hurt the industry here? Is it obviously price or the pricing of, how going overseas is a better option for these companies? And what's it really going to take to bring some back or even spur new, I guess, innovation in the space here in the US, to create more companies to actually, manifest here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, yes, I think that historically the idea is that these kinds of production jobs tend to chase wherever they can find cheaper labor, and that certainly happened within the fashion industry. But the reality is that I think the fashion industry is starting to have a I don't know, change of thought around this, because if you think back to 2020 and COVID and the world shuts down and product is jammed up in ports and on shipping containers and ships being carted around the world. And the reality is that a lot of that international shipping and transport of product halfway around the globe is becoming like more and more expensive. And so I think a lot of producers are starting to have this reality shift that, you know, could we produce here in the US, pay workers more, and save costs on some of this like shipping and export and dealing with ports and some of those things. And so I think that myth is starting to be busted a little bit. What it will take is definitely some investment in terms of, you know, factory upgrades, new technologies, but also like workplace training, job programs, things like that. And so we're hoping that the Federal Fabric Act could have some incentives like that in it that would help to spur this like revitalization of made in the USA production.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I feel like would something like the Fabric Act be a deterrent from, you know, creating, I don't know, more made in the US manufacturing, just given like if there's more regulation, or, you know, companies can now have to be held accountable for wage theft, all the things. But I also just totally, this is just such a random question, but your answer just made me think of this, especially like post-COVID. I'm curious if like how online shopping, if that's had like any, I guess, of like effect on this whole conversation really of like outsourcing overseas, just because like a lot of people aren't even shopping in person anymore. So like regardless, it's going to be like online, the shipping's going to be included. Like, I don't know. I'm just curious if that has like anything to do with this or has effects on this conversation at all.
Yeah, definitely. I don't have a ton of stats off of the top of my head on this, but something that I hear a lot when we're talking with producers about, you know, what would it take to pursue made in the USA manufacturing is that we, because of all the online shopping, we are experiencing a peak returns crisis. So like you think of all of the product that people just like buy online without having tried it on. If the product is not being made very well because brands are trying to cut corners, then it arrives to you. It's not what you wanted. It's not what you envisioned. It doesn't fit you very well. And if the product's really, really cheap, maybe you just take it to the thrift store, you toss it out. That's creating a waste crisis. Or maybe you try to ship it back to the brand, and then what's the brand going to do with it? And that's costly to the brand. And so we're actually hearing a lot of reports from the fashion industry that all of these returns from the shift toward online shopping is creating both like a cost crisis to them and a waste crisis. And so again, like we think or hope that the tide is shifting and people will realize that like maybe this system of just like buying something really quick, having it shipped to your door, maybe it's not the right way to go, and maybe see the tide turning on that a little bit.
That's so interesting. Yeah, sometimes they just like don't even. Sometimes they don't even like have you send it back. They're just like, here's a refund. Like,
just whatever. Yeah. I know. And that's waste, you know, like that's cost to the brand. So it's like financial waste, but then also like, what's that person going to do with that garment that doesn't fit them and they've been refunded? They're just going to toss it, or they're going to take it to a thrift store, and it's going to probably contribute to landfill.
Also, that's like such a dumb move on their end because it like devalues the value of the product. Like, why would I pay something I can get for a refund and get it for free? Like, then I would just say, like, the scam on that is then I would just say, oh, I'm returning it, doesn't fit, but it does fit, and just keep it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, that's, I feel like that's bananas. I see how it happens. But I do think that so much of like keeping it in the US and incentivizing the brands to come back to the US and to produce here makes a lot of sense to your point about COVID, because it's a safer bet. Like, if your product is made here and US laws and regulations are being put against it during some international crisis, your stuff's already in here, meaning you're dealing with US regulators. You're not dealing with transnational shipping corporations that the US government actually has no say over. or something getting stuck in international waters, again, the US has no say over what's going to happen there. So I think that is a huge incentive, to your point. But on a totally different incentive scale, I'm curious about sort of the location, the brick and mortar of the manufacturing, because I know in Massachusetts, for example, used to be a huge textile industry. And there's all these factories, they're getting turned into apartments and sort of the classic, like, let's turn it into something new vibe, which is great. We love to have a rehab moment. But I'm curious, like, if there's any incentives in the Fabric Act or elsewhere for companies to actually take those factories back and turn them back into factories. Because it's like, then the question becomes, are you going to build new buildings for these factories? Are you going to do it sustainably? Like, what does that end of things look like?
Yeah, I think the reality is that the fashion industry has changed a lot since those big, like you said, in the East Coast, those big textile mills where things were all done in one place. And even sometimes workers would live on a campus around those mills. I mean, I just think that the reality of like what the industry looks like and what the equipment looks like and everything, it's changed a lot. And will continue to change with technology developments. But here in the US, top garment manufacturing states, if you want to look at the top 5, they're California, like I mentioned, Los Angeles is the largest, then New York, which I think makes sense, Texas, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And so, in the South, some of the reason why there's hubs there is because historically, a lot of like the raw textile was produced there, so the cotton or things like that. And so that it would make sense that there would be apparel hubs around that. And then, of course, like out east, those big textile manufacturing centers of the past. And so we really hope that, we can see again, like I said, like it's not going to look like it did, but we hope that those states, like California has done, can embrace this idea of like, oh, we are going to be the home of responsibly produced brands. We want to incentivize ethical brands to come create jobs in our state and produce product here.
Yeah. Well, as we look to get the Fabric Act across the finish line, I'm curious what it looks like as far as like which reps are specifically on board. I know you mentioned Senator Gillibrand, but curious like what others are kind of on board with this and where people can like reach out, or just like kind of what that political landscape looks like to pass this bill.
Yeah, so as folks are listening to this, I know I mentioned that the bill is going to be reintroduced to Congress for committee review during Fashion Month. So that's September. So please do follow Girl in the Gov, but also Remake on social, because this is going to be a really exciting time for this piece of policy as it's getting its review and its first round of endorsements from senators. If you're listening, you can also go to fabricact.org and you can sign our petition saying that you're in support of this bill. If you're a fashion brand and you happen to be listening, you can also endorse the bill online there. And those kinds of things are really crucial at this time when we're trying to get early endorsements for the policy. It's important for those representatives to be hearing from people in their state that this matters to them and they think it should pass. So hopefully lots of exciting news to come.
Totally. Oh my gosh. Well, very exciting to have this bill come online and learn about its sort of the background and what's to come. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us all about this.
Thank you so much.